Good afternoon. My name is Erica Gomuke, a 2019 Rice University graduate, Texas criminal justice intern, and a medical student at UT Southwestern. Welcome to our second of many panels brought to you by the Texas Criminal Justice Coalition and the Convict Leasing Labor Project. Today's series, This is a Man's World, Women in Texas Prisons, will dive into various topics including slavery, convict leasing, women in prison, hidden Black history, and more. We are happy to introduce our speaker, and I'll pass it over to Erin to do just so.
Okay, thanks, Erica. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Erin Thompson. I'm a rising senior at North Carolina A&T University, and I'm also an intern with the Texas Criminal Justice Coalition. Firstly, I'd like to express our profound gratitude to our featured speaker, Dr. Theresa Jack, for joining us on our panel today. Dr. Jack here serves as a history professor at Houston Community College. She is also an active member of the American Historical Association, and she is a published author and editor. Her works, such as Huntsville Penitentiary and Incarcerated Women, are centered around the long controversial history of the US prison system, from convict leasing in the late 1800s to the epidemic of incarceration today. So before we begin, is there anything you'd like me to add to your bio, Dr. Jack, or anything that I've missed?
No, that's great. Thank you.
No problem. So I will let Jasmine start us off.
Thanks, Erin. Hi, everyone. My name is Jasmine Smith. I'm a rising junior at Rice University and also a Texas Criminal Justice Coalition intern. Thank you again, Dr. Jack, for joining us today. We're happy to have you here. To start off today's panel, I'd first like to ask, for those of us who aren't aware of the injustices that women, specifically African-American women, face in the prison system and the misconceptions that come along with them, could you provide us with a broader contextual understanding of the general history of women and the prison system?
Sure. So before the Civil War, only white women were incarcerated. Enslaved women were generally kept in the South on the plantation and punished there. So their crimes did not make it to the general criminal justice system. Free Black women in the North, however, were often incarcerated for petty crimes. Kelly Gross has some great work done on Black women convicts in Pennsylvania in particular. But usually it was for white women, and they had to do something pretty serious to get put in prison, usually murder, attempted murder, something like that. It was really common to arrest Black women on petty theft, but a white woman, it was a much more serious crime. And so after the Civil War, after emancipation, Southern prisons began filling up with Black convicts, both male and female. Women are always a smaller percentage of convicts in the South, but Black women are the majority of female convicts across the South.
Well, thank you so much for expanding on a little bit more of like the historical context. So I think we're going to go in a little bit to our panel questions, but first I wanted to introduce myself. Hello, Dr. Jack. My name is Olivia Gomuke. I am actually currently a Rice MBA student. I did go to Rice undergrad, and I'm also a fellow Texas Criminal Justice Coalition intern, and I do some work with the Convict Leasing and Labor Project. And so I'm very honored to share space with you and be in conversation with you. So thank you so much. So I think I wanted to start off this panel discussion with a little bit on how you kind of became interested in this topic, it being such a deep, visceral topic. What kind of led you to explore the lives of these mostly African-American women in Texas prisons?
Well, I'm a Northerner. I'm from Michigan. And so moving to Texas was a bit of a culture shock, to say the least. And my husband and I bought a house near a prison. And that was the first time that I knew anything about the Texas prison system. I was just starting into graduate school after working out kind of in the real world for a long time. And I went back to school, drove by a cotton field by our house. There were Black men, clearly prisoners, out working in the field. There was a guard on horseback with a shotgun and a pack of dogs. And I thought that I had time traveled. And so I started looking into it then. And very quickly, I started researching Harlem Prison, which is now Jester Prison, which is the one that's by my house. That was all Black men. So I didn't see a lot about that until I started delving a little bit more into the research. At the Texas State Archives, I found an investigation from 1875 that mentioned women and abuse, but it was mild. But then I found that there was a handwritten transcript that had not been publicized. And most of the stuff about women was crossed out, but you could still read it. And that was my first indication that there was really some serious stuff going on. And that led me to start looking more and more into it. I do have to say that as a white woman, it's always been something that I try to be very delicate about, cognizant of, that it's not my personal story to tell. So I try to use the voices of the women themselves as much as possible to let them tell their own story. So it's just something that the more you see, and it's horrific. And I think that the more horrific it became, the more I wanted to get past just feeling like they were victims and try and find some agency for them.
You talked about the culture shock kind of moving to Texas and what you experienced and saw. So it kind of has me thinking about the experience in Texas and how that could compare to other states when we're talking about the Texas prison system compared to other prison systems, and involving that with the women, how they worked, what kind of work they did, maybe if that differed from other states, and how maybe the women interacted with men. I don't know. So could you elaborate on that when we talk specifically Texas compared to other states?
Yeah, so there are always women prisoners in the North. They tended to feel like they could rehabilitate them and make them productive citizens, good wives, mothers, that was always the goal, was rehabilitation. And in the South, not just Texas, but across the South, it's just about getting labor out of them. So most of these women in the South, Texas, Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, all across the South, are picking cotton, working in the fields. So that's a different thing. They would have white women in the North sewing, tending chickens, reading the Bible all day long, having sessions to try and improve them. There was also a movement during the Progressive era to train white women to be maids so that when they got out, they could have a job. But none of that stuff happens for Black women. Their place was always to be in that coerced labor pool to take cotton and sugar out of the ground to make money for white people. So there's never that same attitude towards them that there are towards white women. So they did some work, but it was always like women's work that fit into that sphere of domesticity for white women.
So a lot of your work is on how the intersectionality between race and gender, specifically for women. So we just wanted to know, can you talk about how race kind of modified gender in that period? I know there was a huge contrast between the Black woman and the white woman, but can you kind of contextualize exactly how deep that contrast was?
Well, in the prison system, where you see it really clearly is in the work they did and how they're treated, and the amount of respect that white women murderers are given that Black women who are petty thieves do not get. So one of the really clear ways that it jumped out at me was when I looked at the investigations, and they bring women in to testify. The legislators who are there asking the questions of these women, they always called the white women Mrs. whatever her last name was, ma'am, very deferential, very polite, never asking, they would say, had anyone bothered you? And then they would come right out and ask a Black woman if she'd had intercourse with a guard. They always called Black women by their first name, never Mrs., Miss, nothing, always just by their first name. They always asked them about their sex lives when they were having their periods, when they got pregnant, if they'd been prostitutes. These questions never, ever are asked of the white women. And like I said, you know, a white woman that had killed someone got less prison time than a Black woman that stole, you know, a petticoat, which is ridiculous. But it shows us clearly that they want that labor of that woman. They want her to be working. And the women's share farms made money for the state. They weren't as profitable as the ones that had male convicts on them because they were smaller enterprises, but they made money. So they wanted to use them. Women convicts cooked, sewed, might work cleaning house for one of the prison guards, 10 chickens, never hard field labor, ever. So definitely that protected them. White women were seen as women and Black women were seen as labor.
That's interesting that you bring that up. I was sort of wondering how that sort of shaped the way that guards or like people would sort of, I guess, go out and search for those Black women in a way, just because they wanted to, like you said, shape white women to be, I guess, more woman-like. And so we needed to, in order to, I guess, fill those labor type jobs. And so would they sort of go out and look for Black women in certain demographic areas, if that makes sense?
You mean to find them, to funnel them into the system?
Yeah, like just purposely go out and look for them.
Yeah, I mean, Black women are arrested for vagrancy on a regular basis, and that puts them into the criminal justice system. They might not end up all the way in the prison, but in a county jail where they work. You know, they do make them work. Linda Kerber did some great work on women arrested for vagrancy in Houston, and they make them out there cleaning streets. And in the 1860s and 70s, cleaning streets in Houston was, you know, people dumped their chamber pots and horse manure. And I mean, it was not just like out sweeping, it was disgusting. Right. And that's what Black women did. And so they arrested them for vagrancy. And it didn't matter if the husband in the family was working. The wife had to work too if you were Black. And for white people, that wasn't the case. You know, there's this different tier of what they expect Black women to do. So yeah, they do. And they arrest people on the most ridiculous offenses just to imprison them, to incarcerate them. And there's no other reason than that they want that labor. They want that money. If you think about, like, when people were enslaved, the husband, the father, couldn't protect his wife from being raped or having to do this grueling work, or his children from being beaten. They don't have that. They can't do it. The main thing that Black men wanted to do after they were not enslaved anymore was to protect their wives and to protect their children and to not have them out in the fields. But those vagrancy laws make it so that they can't do that. You know, that you can't have that kind of white middle class idea where the husband works and the wife and the kids stay home if you're Black. You have to be out working. And the sharecropping contracts would insist that the wife and the children work as well. So it's a whole system that kind of takes those traditional kind of Victorian feminine ideas away from Black women. They're not allowed to have that.
Okay, so kind of on that topic, but I kind of want to move towards a conceptual type of topic that we read in one of your works about just the word reformable and punishment and prison systems and how it was kind of seen as rehabilitation for men, but for women who were put in prison, it almost seemed like it wasn't rehabilitation for them. Like, it's almost like once you're in prison and you're a woman, there's no rehabilitation possible. But for men, they had opportunities. So I don't know whether it's the societal norms, they still exist to this day, but could you explain kind of the thinking behind that kind of when women are put into prison, it's like, you know, they're done. Meanwhile, maybe men have more opportunities.
So yeah, it's more true of white convicts for men as well. Particularly in the South, there's this idea that Black men cannot be rehabilitated either. But for women, for Black women, there's this idea somehow that they're fallen, that they are beyond respectability, that they are naturally more, sexual, that they are more lustful, that they question them a lot in the investigations, whether they were prostitutes or not, which they deny. Some of them are arrested for prostitution, but most of them are not, and they ask everybody if they were prostitutes. So there's this idea that they'll never be respectable. And I think that's a legacy from slavery, like Deborah Gray White, the Jezebel idea that they're hypersexual and that they can never be rehabilitated beyond it, that's part of their nature. And I think today that there still is a perception somehow that young Black women are sexualized earlier than white women. There's a lot of times you'll see stories about Black girls that are 13 or 14 years old, but they look womanly, and people treat them in that way. So I think that does continue today. The kind of disrespect towards their age, what they're going through, and that they're just bad, right? That they can't be rehabilitated. While I don't do a lot of studies on modern prison stuff, just things that you see women in prison, all of the ridiculous reality shows that they have out, and the women in prison are always hypersexualized all the time, for people to watch and laugh at or whatever it is. And I think that would definitely make it harder when they come out of prison to go to a normal life at all. White women, it's easier. There's a story out of Texas in the 1940s, one of the white women that was in for murder, and she gets into the Goree Girls, which is a country western swing band that played at the prison rodeo, and they become really popular. They play on a local radio station, and people would come to see them, and she's like this really attractive white woman. And when she gets out of prison, so she gets out early, and then she remarries, and nobody knew that she had been in prison. Like, she just goes back to her life like it's nothing, and nobody knew that she'd been in prison. And a reporter tracked her down, and she's like, "That's not me." And she just goes on with her life. But for a Black woman, it's harder. There's a stigma that's attached.
Thank you so much for that explanation, Dr. Jack. And speaking on the different perceptions between white and Black women and the different treatment that they received even during the convict leasing times in the late 1800s, you did speak about the different treatment that they received from guards, the more brutal punishments that they received for crimes that were more petty than what white women were committing. I just wanted you to talk about kind of how Black women may have resisted, or how Black women may have found ways to survive in that climate, especially being in the prison system. I know that in one of your pieces, you did talk about how Black women were able to express their sexuality differently than white women were. So I did find it interesting that you mentioned how younger Black women are sexualized today. So I just wanted you to elaborate maybe on how Black women back then would have used their sexuality as maybe a form of resistance or a form of how to survive.
Okay, so first of all, even while enslaved, Black women were freer with their sexuality than white women, because white women had that whole Victorian kind of prudishness pushed on them, and that wasn't part of the Black community. I mean, they had a normal sex life where white women were like these rigid kind of, the wife, and you don't have sex outside of marriage, and so I would say that Black women had a more normal and natural sex life than white women at the time. But I think that attitude, then they found that if you were incarcerated and you were being worked brutally, that if you could avoid some of that backbreaking work by having sex with someone. And one woman, she says, I thought if I got a chance, I'd do it. And they said, why? And she's like, being with a man, right? Like, I'm in prison, and why not? That's normal that people would want to have sex. So whether she really, wanted to have sex with that particular guy, but she found that it was something that she had that could make her life easier. Now, there are very few reports of Black women convicts saying that they felt like they'd been raped. You see lots of testimony, though, where they talk about, he asked me, I said no, he left me alone and went on to the next woman. So they do seem to have, you don't want to say the word choice necessarily, but it does seem like they did have some choice in who. And if they didn't want to, they didn't seem to have to. But by finding that power in their sexuality to make their lives a little easier, or to hope to get a pardon, or to get a little bit of money. One woman talks about how she needed money for her sick mother. And so she picked out the guy that was least offensive to her, and he gave her some money. Another guy, she said, you don't have enough money, it's not worth my time. So they have that. If that's what you're stripped down to, is just sex, and you use that to make your life better. There's a lot of work on sex workers even today, that yes, it's exploitive, yes, it's abusive, but they do get to exercise some choice. And I think for me, in trying to find some agency for these women, that was one of the things that stood out to me, is that they were able to use something that society had kind of pushed on them and turn it around to their benefit. You also see that they resist in ways like working slow, because they get punished a lot because they're not working fast enough, and being sassy, which means they're talking back to the guards. So they didn't just passively take it. They did fight back. They get punished for it, but they push back when they can.
That's interesting that you talk about that, just because people, we usually don't discuss about the ways that these women resisted these type of systems. But moving towards some of the labor that they actually did, you've discussed how a Black woman's role focused on the hard labor that would contribute to the nation's economic well-being. So I wanted to ask you, what contributions did women, particularly Black women, make to the labor force and the infrastructure of the New South, qualitatively and also quantitatively?
So in the prison system particularly, they are growing cotton, and that of course is the big thing. They also work as domestic laborers. Some of the women would be sent to work as maids for the guards' families, cooks, that's a big one. Black women in particular, outside of the criminal justice system, of course, if they're not working sharecropping in cotton extractive agriculture, or they're, they might move to a cotton mill town, they're not going to get a job inside the cotton mill. Those are for poor white women, but they do work taking care of the white women's kids, cleaning their houses, cooking their food at very little pay. But all of those poor white women wouldn't be able to go and work in those cotton mills if there weren't Black women at home supporting them to make that easy for them to do. But since those were the only jobs open to them, and same thing with Black men, right? The only jobs at those cotton mills open to Black men were unloading the bales and doing that heavy lifting. They didn't get those higher paying jobs inside the mill that were, supposedly better jobs. Those were for white people. They didn't pay very well. There's been a lot of really great work done on that. That the cotton mill, the white owners got together and said, well, we'll divide that labor and say these are only white people jobs. Then we don't need to pay those white people that much money because they'll feel special because it's a white job. And then these are Black people jobs that are harder and less money. So yeah, Black women always work. They were mostly in agriculture though. The sharecropping, they don't have a lot of opportunities to do anything else until after the Depression, I would say, when they finally get to move on, and some defense industry jobs during World War II. But other than that, they're in extractive agriculture in some way or another, making that possible for other people.
Yeah, that's very interesting. Talking about, you know, the role that Black women played in the New South with those domestic jobs, like you mentioned. So it kind of has me thinking, the Sugarland 95 has been really gaining media attention as of recently, the past recent years. I've had the privilege of working with the Texas Criminal Justice Coalition and alongside the Convict, Leasing, and Labor Project. And I first want to pay significant gratitude to our wonderful founder at CLLP, Reginald Moore, rest his soul, who is the reason really why Sugarland 95 has been able to have the energy and passion to be found and fighting for those leased convicts. And so it's really been able to be centered because of his work, and I want to be able to pay homage to him. But my question is really surrounding what your response was when the Sugarland 95 kind of started to gain steam, and what I've learned as an intern for both CLLP and TCJC is that there was one woman who was a leased convict. So I wanted to know if maybe you knew a little bit about that and her remains that were found.
So I also want to comment on Reggie. He was so passionate about what he did, and Reggie called me up years ago, right when he was first starting his group, and asked me if I would come and speak at his first event, which I did. And so I've known Reggie for a number of years, and it was really sad to hear of his passing. And he was so passionate about what he was doing, and he knew, as many people knew, that there had to be more convict bodies buried out there. There has to be. And I think that there are still more in other former prison farms that will be found as it's developed, which is unfortunate that it has to wait for that. But when they found the Sugarland 95, I mean, for Reggie, it's like, see, I told you, right? I told you they were there, and finally, you know, they are. And then it got so much attention, and, you know, people wanted to talk about it. I was on the City of Sugarland Task Force, which was very contentious. They really just wanted us to come in and kind of rubber stamp what they were doing, which we didn't. I've been on the Fort Bend ISD advisory board, and, you know, I have to say that the people, the teachers, the curriculum people at Fort Bend ISD, they're really, really supportive of this. Now, I don't know if all of the administration is as supportive, but the people that are actually teaching our kids want them to learn about this. They're very passionate about it. And so I'm happy to help. I've given a talk to the teachers about the topic, and I'll continue to do that to advise them and help them with their curriculum, because I think it's important. You know, we need to know that this whole city of Sugarland was built on the backs of convicts. You know, they're the people doing the work, and they deserve some recognition for that. You know, we would not have the city that we have now if we didn't have those convicts doing that work. So I'm glad that there's a lot of attention to it. I hope that it will remain. As far as the one woman that was found, that is something that I am not that well versed on, because I know that they said they thought it was a woman. They're not 100% sure. I know that the the archaeology studies that are being done are, I believe they're complete, but the report is not complete. So I don't have access to that information. I believe they're sending that off to the school board soon, and then it'll be published. And when they publish it, there will be genetic information, and some of the people that they've identified, those names will be released because they've done that work. They've had genealogists and stuff working on that, but that wasn't something that I was part of. So for me, thinking that there was a woman there, if there was, she may have been brought out there to cook or do laundry, because they generally did not send women out to those male-dominated farms. That was really, seems unusual to me. There was, in 1884, they moved the women from Huntsville to their first prison farm, which was the Johnson farm. And that was up by Huntsville, you know. And so to have women spread out all over, all the way down to Sugar Land is not something I've come across. So I don't know who she is or why she would be there. They segregated the farms. They would have different bunkhouses for blacks and whites. If they had white men at those farms, they were there doing different kinds of labor. They weren't out in the fields necessarily. In 1904, they moved the women to the Eastham Farm, which is also up by Huntsville. And then in 1910, they moved them to Goree, which is also by Huntsville. So they were share farms. So I don't know how she got there, and I don't know who she is. So I'll be interested to find out too, because that's unusual.
Thank you for that answer. So this conversation has centered a lot around the tropes of Black women in the prison system, from how they were able to kind of use their sexuality as a form of resistance, how they, were perceived by the general public and things of that nature. I just wanted to know how you, Dr. Jack, see these tropes from way back then manifesting themselves in the prison system today. If you see any significant progression from prison culture back in the late 1800s and prison culture today as far as it goes with Black women versus white women.
I think that even today, for a lot of African-American families, that the kind of politics of respectability are still important to them. And that if somebody in their family is in prison, that it's embarrassing, shameful. They don't want people to know about it necessarily. But those middle-class Black families, it seems less likely that they're going to be targeted by the criminal justice system, or that they'll at least be able to afford an attorney to help get them out of the situation. So I think you see a lot of poor Black women in prison on drug charges, prostitution charges, whatever it might be. And it's clearly a symptom of larger problems in the society with racism. White women that are in prison, I mean, there are white women in prison, but they tend to be mostly connected with drug offenses, I believe. And it's interesting because my mother, after she and my dad got divorced, she moved to Florida from Michigan, and she got a job as a prison guard at a women's prison in Florida, which I never, who thinks your mother's going to do that? And she actually said that the convicts, the women that were in there that were murderers, were easier to deal with than the women that were in for drug dealing. She says, a woman might kill her husband, she's not going to go out and kill anybody else, and they're fine. But the women that had been in for more serious crimes were harder for her to deal with. And she for her, and she's a product of her time and racist, as a lot of older white women are. The people that she saw most troublesome were usually African American that were in prison for those drug charges. And so it kind of builds this idea in your head that a whole class of people are more prone to criminality. And that's, I had this discussion with some friends of mine. We have a kind of old white lady book club where we're reading a lot of Black literature. And we had this discussion last week about how if Black behavior was criminalized after the Civil War, to put them in prison, and that the only thing that white people see is a prison full of Black people, then it is embedded in your mind that Black people are more prone to criminality. You have that idea, and it just perpetuates itself and continues to fill, even to this day, the prison with African Americans, because we as a society have that pushed on us all the time from the end of the Civil War on, that Black people are prone to criminality. And so we just kind of accept it and oh, well, that's just the way it is. I don't have a solution to it other than for people to stop being a bunch of racists. But if I had a solution to that, then, yay, but I don't. But it is definitely something that I think continues today. The legacy of convict leasing definitely is affecting the prison system today. You know, when you think about the Sugar Land 95, those 95 men, or 94 men and a woman, they were taken from their families. They were taken out of their families as a breadwinner. They were taken out of their family as emotional support, a father to children, a brother, a husband, you know, they're gone. And the money that they could have helped establish for their family that would start that generational wealth, those families don't have that. And, you know, how are you going to get ahead? How are you going to do anything different if the system is designed to keep your family from doing that? You know, how is the father going to work hard and buy a home and pass it on to his kids if he's in prison for something stupid, you know, that wasn't even really a crime? So those kinds of things and that legacy, I think, is definitely part of the bigger problem that we have today.
Yeah, and before we get to like the Q&A with the audience, I wanted to make sure that we got an overall good scope of it, and I think we've really delved into this topic. However, one thing that I think we didn't cover as much maybe were the demographics of the women in prison. So like, yes, we know the gender, but like age and things of that nature, because if I can think correctly, I think in one of your pieces, there was a woman, I believe a white woman maybe, who was 60 years old or something, and they said she was like the ideal type of inmate, unproblematic, overt, because I guess that, and then also like not fertile, of course, you know, because she was like 60. So that could go to maybe the overly sexualized part, but could you explain maybe a bit, just anything about the demographics of the women in prison, their age, them having children, and things of that nature?
So for most of the women in prison were 30 and under. There are women there, Black women as young as 14, a lot of teenagers, young 20s. And these are women that come, so the prisons are kind of concentrated on the eastern half of the state, but they did send people from all over. Now, the Black women prisoners tend to come from the eastern counties or through the Cotton Belt, where their population was concentrated. But they're mostly young. And you know, that clearly, if they're gonna make it out of the county jail and into prison, it's usually because they think they can use them for work. Right. There's even cases of women, Black women being sent to prison just for a year. And normally that would be something that would be held in a county jail if you're in that short of a period of time. So getting them up to Huntsville and into one of the women's farms, there has to be a reason for that. There were a handful of older white women, you know, in their 40s and 50s. And most of the white women that were in prison that were younger were in there for killing their kids. So infanticide, that was the biggest charge for white women. That's what most of them were in for. Older white women, there were some that killed their husbands, but very rarely did you see a white woman that her arrest record showed that she'd been arrested for theft or something like that. It's usually some really serious murder, attempted murder type crime. But most of the Black women were young. I don't have very many records. I think there was maybe a 47-year-old Black woman in Huntsville before they shifted them over to the farms. They called her Old Jane, and there's not a whole lot of information about her because when they did the investigation, she wasn't there anymore. But at one point she had had a child and they punished her for having the kid. They shaved her head, they put her in the dark cell, and they took her baby away from her. But the records don't show when that actually happened. So she could have been out of prison for 10 years by the time they talked about it, but they referred to her as Old Jane, which I don't know how old she really was. But yeah, the young women that can do work. That's the same with men. They want young, strong men to do that labor. So you get a lot of teenagers and 20s to 30s Black men in prison during that period as well. And most of them are farm women. You know, there are some in the cities. There are some women from Galveston that were arrested for prostitution, but mostly they're country, you know, kind of out on share farms in and around Houston and other Cotton Belt areas.
You said most of these women are young, so that usually means that they're fertile.
Yes.
So that brings up the point of mothers. And so what would happen to their children? So I guess the mothers would get punished for having the children, but what would happen to those kids?
We don't know. Early on, we don't know. They took them away. Maybe they gave them to family members, but there's no records that show that. In 1910, there's a reform law that reforms the prison system. And one of the things that they said is that if a woman had a child in prison, that she could keep it with her until it was 6 years old. And then they would send it, I would hope, to a family member. But they don't talk about it. They don't say, and it's something that's really hard to get to because there's not going to be any formal adoption papers or anything like that. But you notice that one woman had been in prison for 11 years and she had a 4-year-old, and the investigators tried to say that she was pregnant when she got there. Like, you're not pregnant for that long, please. Nobody carries a baby for 7, 8 years, and then has it. So, but just trying to make it look like, oh, no, she was pregnant before she came here. There wasn't anything going on. But yes, sadly, that's really hard. And, Talitha LaFloria talked about women in Georgia and that they killed the babies. There's no indication that happened. I haven't found that here, but her book, Chained in Silence, I hope that y'all have read that because it's a great book. But she talks about drowning babies in the river and making the women go right back to work, basically. So there aren't a lot of reports of little kids at the prison. So I'm assuming that and clearly they're having kids. So I'm assuming they're taking them away and giving them to somebody. I hope. That's what I hope, and that they're not killing them, but I haven't been able to find that information. It's something that really, when you're a historian and you're looking and you're looking and you're looking for the information and you can't find it and you can't say decisively, it's really hard. Because I like answers. I want to know what happens. So, yeah.
Yes, it's a very fascinating, sad, but interesting topic. And we're very grateful to have you here, like we mentioned prior, but very grateful for your time. And I think that closes our panel questions, but we do have a few audience questions. So we're gonna kind of kick into that. And so I think the first audience question that we had, that was also happened to be a question that we had in this process of reading your work, was kind of what your difficulties were when you were trying to tell the history and the stories of the inner lives of Black women in the prison system.
Yeah, because you don't want to put words in their mouth. So I tried to just use things that they actually said in those investigations. And so my information is limited to that. There's not an archive full of letters written by women in prison, Black women in prison during this time. Many of them were illiterate, which you can see on when they bring them in their intake card, their convict register. Most of them are listed as illiterate. So there's not any other way to get to it. And so I try to just use their words without speculating a lot. And I also try to make sure I'm not projecting my kind of middle-aged white lady view on it, which is hard because I'm a middle-aged white lady. And I try to put myself in their shoes and think about what it would be like and be empathetic. I think I'm a really empathetic person in general, which is part of what makes this so hard. When I study, I would sit in the archive sometimes and cry because it was so hard to read stuff. When I teach it sometimes and I'm talking in class, I'm like crying because it's awful. But I didn't want to just feel awful. I wanted to find something for these women because clearly they survived it. They go through, they get out, hopefully they go on with their lives, and that they have that strength inside of them to do it. And I wanted to be able to find some agency for them, but it's hard to find. And it's a difficult subject. It's painful to teach, it's painful to study, it's painful to write about, painful to talk about. So yeah.
Yes, that is a very painful topic, like you've mentioned, and it's very eye-opening at the same time. to what we faced in the past and what we're facing right now in the future. Sorry about that. I just wanted to ask actually a question for you, Dr. Jack, from one of the viewers of the panel. They wanted to know that if you've come across any information that explains the impact of women being incarcerated and removed from the family structure, because we did talk about how men being taken away from the family structure was extremely impactful and changed the family dynamic of the African American family for generations to come. So how exactly did the woman being incarcerated change that family dynamic?
And again, this is something that it would be pure speculation on my part, because there aren't records that show that. And that's something that I actually would like to work on, to maybe try and trace some women from prison through the census records and try and find that information. But I mean, I can only imagine, I mean, think about what it would be like to have your mother in prison from the minute you're born, you know, and not have her with you. And again, that family labor, the agriculture depended, particularly for sharecroppers, on having the entire family working. So I'm sure that it was economically bad for those families to not have their daughters or wives or sisters there helping. But most importantly, I would think just for the women that had children and how just difficult that was for them. And we have a lot of kids that live with their grandparents now, not just in the Black community, you know, in the white community as well. And it has to change them. I think back, you know, how I was really fortunate, right? I grew up with both of my parents. My parents didn't get divorced until I was out of high school, right? So I had like this normal kind of idyllic childhood. And you think about just how different my life could have been had my mother been taken away or my dad been taken away for whatever reason, for the prison system or beyond. So I don't know, that's something that I would really like to get at. And I'm not sure how to do it other than some deep genealogy work and trying to track people down. But it is, again, it's something that I've thought about, something that I would like to do, something I think is important to show just what it does to a family to have somebody taken away by the prison system.
For sure. You talked about your personal testimony, and specifically me being a Black, but also African-American, being of Nigerian descent woman, looking at these topics. It is definitely very eye-opening and visceral for me to kind of engage with this work, but also this topic. So it had me thinking the reality of you, like you mentioned, being a middle-aged white woman, the difficulties or just kind of the sensitivities that you've had to move with surrounding this topic, and speaking on specifically the treatment that Black women have in the prison system, and especially with the current climate we're in. I was wondering kind of if your work has kind of gained a little bit more steam right now, or also what the sentiment has been and how you've navigated it.
It's tough. You know, I had a really long talk with Callie Gross when I first started writing about this. And, you know, we talked about these same things. I said, it's a really, because she got a lot of pushback from the Black community because she talked about Black women that were actually criminals. And she's like, oh yeah, people were really mad about, like, how dare you talk about something negative? And so she helped me a lot about how to just negotiate that. I haven't gotten a lot of pushback, but it's something that I deal with a lot. When I teach African American history at HCC, that's the first thing we start with. The students walk into my class and they're all looking at me funny. I'm like, okay, you're probably wondering why an old white lady is teaching your class. So let's talk about that. Let's talk about why there aren't more Black professors here. I teach at the Northwest Katy campus, and we don't have any, we have African American history professors, but they're at other campuses. And, you know, this is my field of expertise. And I'm like, well, let's talk about that. And let's talk about what that means, why I'm teaching the class. And so I try to be really open with my students and tell them that I can empathize, but I can't be them. And we talk about it a lot. We talk about it a lot in class. But I haven't gotten a lot of pushback from people about me writing about this yet. So I don't know if that will happen, but so far, no. I try to be very sensitive about it, and I try to acknowledge it when I'm talking and when I'm writing. So maybe that headed it off. I don't know.
Okay, we have two more audience questions that we want to hit. They're both really great. So one person said that she read when Sugarland 95, it was a very popular sugar industry, of course. It had many people from many ethnic backgrounds. So I don't know if you know, and they just wanted to ask, are there any examples of non-Black / non-white women in prison?
So the Sugarland 95, so when you talk about convict leasing and you talk about sugar work, it's all Black men. Now, that doesn't mean that there aren't white convicts in Sugarland, but they're there, they're working, they're maybe making bricks, they're working in the sugar house where they're actually processing the sugar cane. They're doing more skilled labor. So there are white men in Sugarland doing work, but they're not out cutting sugar cane. They're not doing the hard labor. They're doing something completely different. Now, where white men convicts did do hard labor was in the coal mines. So like out in Calvert County. And the reason they put white men in the coal mines is because they thought that that would be something that they could learn a skill and have a productive job when they got out. That's why Black men didn't get to do that. Turned out to be a really crappy place to be. The Calvert coal mines were horrible. That's actually why they ended leasing, is because a bunch of white men were dying and getting mistreated. And they're like, oh my God, we can't have that. You know, we can abuse Black men for decades, but don't let those white men suffer. But yeah, they did some stuff like that. White men would work maybe cutting wood on a railroad camp. But they would not they didn't put white women out in that kind of labor. They're sewing, they're doing those sorts of things inside the prison. They're protected. Where white women are protected, Black women are out in the field, which would make them more vulnerable to sexual abuse and being whipped and all kinds of things. So yeah, Sugarland, Black guys in the field, white guys inside.
Thank you for answering that. Okay, so last audience question. What other topics of women in prison are not researched enough about and think need more research in the future?
Well, I think what we already talked about, what happens to them afterwards, I think is really important. I think that is something that if I'm not able to get to it, I hope somebody is, because it is, that's where you see the long-term impact, right? What does it do to a woman to come out of prison and have been whipped, having been tortured on the horse, which was this horrible medieval torture device where they would make you straddle it with your legs and pull it down on your genitals? They did that to men and women. What does that psychologically do to you when you come out, right? Those are things I think that need to be looked at. What is that long-term effect on those women when they get out of prison? That legacy of violence and abuse and disrespect, what that does to a person. And harder to get to, but I think it's important.
Yes. Well, seems like with everything that you've said, this is, clearly a very deep and visceral topic that a plethora of research could really expound on, and we're grateful for the work that you've contributed. And I can say personally, I'm grateful for having ally women like you that are doing the work. It's really important doing this work, understanding racial history, specifically Black women and their impact, or how they have been impacted by systemic racism and the criminal justice system. So we're really grateful for your time, Erin, Erica, and Jazz, and I are all grateful to represent TCJC and CLLP on this panel. So we just want to express our supreme gratitude, and thank you so much for your time. And I hope everyone enjoyed this panel discussion. It's been really impactful.
Thank you. Happy to be here.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thanks.
Thank you.